Jamal Lawson arrived at the headquarters of Summit Solutions Group with a sense of purpose and quiet determination. The sleek glass building reflected the bustling city skyline, and Jamal took a deep breath before walking through the revolving doors. It was his first day as an intern, a position he had earned not because of his family name, but through his own merit and hard work. Jamal was intent on proving himself based on his abilities and not the identity of his father, David Lawson, the CEO of the company. He had purposefully kept this connection hidden, not wanting any special treatment or expectations. He wanted to learn and make his way in the world on his own terms. As he approached the reception desk, Jamal was directed to a conference room where the new intern orientation was being held. It was there that he first crossed paths with Gary Thompson, the regional manager. Gary was a middle-aged man with graying hair and a sharp, condescending smile that seemed more like a sneer. From the moment they were introduced, Jamal could sense an underlying hostility in Gary's demeanor. It wasn't overt at first. Gary maintained a professional tone while introducing himself, but there was a subtle undercurrent to his words that didn't sit well with Jamal. "Ah, Jamal, nice to meet you," Gary said with a tight smile. "You know, we don't get a lot of diversity in these positions, so it's good to see you taking advantage of this opportunity." Jamal raised an eyebrow, unsure whether to respond or let the comment slide. He chose the latter, smiling politely and thanking Gary for the introduction. He had heard comments like this before, backhanded compliments that hinted at assumptions about his competence or how he got to where he was. But Jamal had come prepared to deal with such remarks, knowing that his performance would be the loudest statement he could make. The first week was filled with training sessions and getting to know the company's structure. Jamal noticed that Gary's attention seemed unusually focused on him compared to the other interns. During training exercises, Gary would often hover over Jamal's shoulder, offering unsolicited advice in a patronizing tone. When Jamal excelled in his assignments, Gary would downplay his achievements or hint that he must have had some prior help. "You know, Jamal, it's not just about looking good on paper," Gary remarked one afternoon after Jamal completed a complex data analysis report. "It's the real-world experience that counts. And sometimes, that's what certain people, well, they just don't have it yet." Jamal recognized the underlying message in Gary's words, that he, in Gary's eyes, was somehow less qualified, an outsider trying to prove he belonged. Despite these subtle and not-so-subtle jabs, Jamal kept his cool. He knew that if he allowed himself to react, it would only feed into Gary's narrative. So, he focused on his work, determined to demonstrate his worth through results, not words. However, as the days turned into weeks, Gary's attitude began to shift from subtle remarks to overt hostility. He began assigning Jamal the most mundane and labor-intensive tasks that were often unrelated to the projects Jamal was meant to focus on. When Jamal raised this in a team meeting, Gary dismissed it as part of the learning curve for new interns. "You've got to start somewhere, Jamal," Gary said in front of the entire team. "Not everyone can handle the tougher responsibilities right away." The way he said it, directed at Jamal but loud enough for everyone to hear, made it clear that he was implying Jamal wasn't capable of more important tasks. Some of the other interns exchanged glances, sensing the tension, but no one dared to challenge Gary. Jamal felt the sting of embarrassment, but maintained his composure. He knew that Gary's words were intended to provoke a reaction, and he wasn't going to give him the satisfaction. One evening, Jamal found himself staying late to finish up a particularly tedious report that Gary had assigned to him at the last minute. It was busy work, something that could easily have been handled by an automated program, but Gary insisted Jamal do it manually. As he sat alone in the dimly lit office, Jamal reflected on his decision to keep his identity a secret. It wasn't just to avoid favoritism, it was also a test for himself. He wanted to prove, beyond any doubt, that he could succeed without relying on his father's name or influence. Despite Gary's relentless attempts to undermine him, Jamal found small moments of satisfaction in his work. He took pride in completing every task, no matter how menial, with precision and dedication. He believed that every challenge was an opportunity to grow and that his perseverance would eventually pay off. Still, the constant pressure and demeaning comments took their toll, and Jamal began to realize that he would have to confront Gary's behavior sooner or later. The breaking point came during a critical client presentation. Gary was leading the presentation, but halfway through, he stumbled over a key piece of information. He had overlooked an important aspect of the client's requirements, and the room began to tense up as the client's representatives exchanged uneasy looks. Jamal, who had prepared thoroughly, saw the mistake and instinctively stepped in to save the presentation. He confidently addressed the client's concerns, providing the necessary information and proposing a revised strategy that resonated with the client's needs. The tension in the room dissolved as the clients visibly relaxed and nodded in approval. Gary, however, was seething. Jamal could feel Gary's eyes on him, but he refused to let the anger intimidate him. When the meeting ended, the clients expressed their gratitude for the quick thinking and professionalism, specifically acknowledging Jamal's contributions. Gary, on the other hand, barely concealed his resentment as he shook hands with the clients, avoiding Jamal's gaze. Later that day, back at the office, Gary pulled Jamal aside. His face was red with anger as he hissed, "Don't think for a second that you're special just because you managed to get one thing right. You got lucky today, but luck doesn't last." Jamal didn't respond. He had made his point during the presentation, and he knew that engaging with Gary's bitterness would only escalate the situation. Instead, he nodded politely and returned to his desk, refusing to let Gary's words diminish the satisfaction he felt from turning the presentation around. However, Jamal also knew that this wouldn't be the end of Gary's attempts to undermine him. If anything, Gary's frustration would only drive him to double down on his efforts to discredit Jamal. As the days passed, Jamal continued to focus on his work, silently waiting for the right moment to reveal the truth about who he really was. He wasn't looking for revenge or vindication. He just wanted to prove that he could succeed based on his own abilities. But he also knew that there would come a time when he would have to stand up for himself, and when that moment arrived, he intended to face it with the same resolve and composure that had carried him through every challenge so far. Gary's frustration simmered beneath the surface, building with every passing day. Jamal's competence had become an unspoken challenge to his authority. Despite the constant barrage of menial tasks and Gary's cutting remarks, Jamal had shown resilience, remaining focused on his work and delivering results when it mattered most. The successful client presentation was a turning point, not just for Jamal, but for the entire team. It subtly shifted the dynamic within the office, and even though no one openly addressed it, there was a growing sense of recognition for Jamal's abilities. This only deepened Gary's resentment, pushing him closer to the edge. For Gary, Jamal's growing confidence was intolerable. It felt like a personal affront, as though Jamal's presence in the office threatened the hierarchy he believed was in place. Gary had always seen himself as someone who climbed the corporate ladder through sheer grit and cunning. But in reality, He had used a combination of underhanded tactics, manipulation, and favoritism to reach his position. Jamal's quiet strength and refusal to play along with Gary's games were unraveling the carefully constructed facade of superiority Gary had built over the years. The tipping point came during a team meeting where the focus was on preparing for a major board presentation. Jamal had worked tirelessly on a segment involving market analysis, compiling a comprehensive report that highlighted key trends and strategies. He knew the material inside out, and his preparation showed in the way he presented his findings to the team. He spoke clearly, fielded questions with ease, and even offered innovative suggestions that received nods of approval from several senior team members. But while others were impressed, Gary's frustration only deepened. He watched with clenched fists as Jamal effortlessly navigated through the presentation, commanding the room's attention. In Gary's mind, Jamal was overstepping his bounds. This wasn't the role of an intern, he thought angrily. Interns were supposed to be obedient, quiet, and grateful, not confident and competent. As the meeting concluded and team members began to file out, Gary called Jamal over. "Jamal," Gary said, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Can I have a word?" Jamal paused, sensing the tension in Gary's voice, but he nodded and followed him to an empty office. Once the door was closed, Gary dropped the pretense. His smile vanished, replaced by a scowl of barely contained fury. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" Gary asked, his voice low but venomous. "You're an intern. Your job is to assist, not to take the spotlight." Jamal met Gary's gaze, refusing to be intimidated. "I was asked to contribute to the presentation," he replied calmly. "I did my part, just like everyone else." Gary's expression darkened. "You don't get it, do you?" he sneered. "You're here because of a diversity initiative, not because you belong in this room. But if you keep trying to act like you're something special, you're going to find out just how replaceable you really are." Jamal felt his patience fraying. He had endured Gary's insults and attempts to undermine him for weeks, staying silent to maintain his professionalism. But this time, Gary had crossed a line. Jamal took a deep breath and steadied himself before responding. "With all due respect, Gary," Jamal said, his voice steady but firm, "I'm here because I earned this position, and if my work threatens you, that's not my problem." Gary's face flushed red with anger. He took a step forward, his voice rising. "Don't you dare talk to me like that. I know exactly what you're trying to do. Trying to play the race card to make everyone feel sorry for you. Well, that's not going to work with me." Jamal felt a surge of anger, but forced himself to stay composed. He could sense the growing hostility in Gary's tone, and he knew that escalating the confrontation wouldn't help. Just as he was about to respond, the door to the office opened, and David Lawson stepped inside. There was a moment of stunned silence as David surveyed the scene. He had come looking for Jamal, and from the look on his face, it was clear that he had overheard part of the conversation. Gary's expression shifted from anger to confusion, and then to a mix of fear and disbelief as he registered David's presence. "Gary?" David said calmly, but there was an unmistakable edge to his voice. "I think we need to have a conversation." Gary straightened up, trying to regain his composure. He forced a nervous smile and cleared his throat. "Mr. Lawson, Not here," David interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Let's discuss this in the boardroom." Gary swallowed hard, nodding silently. He cast a wary glance at Jamal, who stood quietly, watching the exchange unfold. Jamal knew that this was the moment everything would change, but he wasn't sure what to expect. He followed David and Gary down the hallway to the boardroom, where several senior executives were already seated, waiting for the meeting to begin. As they entered the room, Gary's unease was palpable. He took a seat at the table, fidgeting nervously, while David stood at the head of the room. Jamal remained near the doorway, unsure of where this was going, but sensing that something significant was about to happen. David waited until everyone was settled before speaking. "Before we start this meeting, there's something I need to address," David began, his gaze fixed on Gary. "It has come to my attention that there have been issues within this team that require immediate resolution." Gary shifted uncomfortably, trying to maintain a neutral expression. He seemed to be searching for a way to explain himself, but David didn't give him the chance. "I've heard enough about what's been happening," David continued, his voice calm, but carrying an unmistakable weight. "I've witnessed behavior that goes against everything this company stands for. Behavior that is not only unprofessional, but unacceptable on every level." Gary's face drained of color as he realized where this was heading. He opened his mouth to speak, but David held up a hand, silencing him. "Before you say anything, Gary, I want you to understand something very clearly," David said, his tone firm. "Jamal Lawson is not just an intern in this company. He is my son." The room fell into stunned silence. Gary's eyes widened in disbelief, his mouth hanging open as he tried to process what he had just heard. He looked from David to Jamal, as if searching for some sign that this was a mistake or a cruel joke. But there was no mistaking the seriousness in David's voice, or the calm resolve in Jamal's expression. Your son?" Gary stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," David replied, his gaze unwavering. "And I've been aware of how you've treated him since the day he started here." Gary's face turned a sickly shade of pale. The realization of what he had done, of who he had been targeting with his insults and hostility, began to sink in. His entire world seemed to crumble in an instant. The room remained silent as David continued. "I wanted to give you the benefit of the doubt, to see if you would recognize your mistakes and change your behavior," David said. "But instead, you chose to double down on your actions, believing that no one would hold you accountable." Gary opened his mouth, searching for words, but nothing came out. He looked around the room, seeing the faces of his colleagues staring back at him with varying degrees of shock, disappointment, and disapproval. There was no one to come to his defense, no way to explain away what he had done. David's expression softened slightly as he looked at Jamal. Jamal has shown more professionalism, resilience, and integrity in these few weeks than some people have shown in their entire careers. And that is why he is here. Not because of his last name, but because he earned his place. The silence in the room was heavy, and Gary seemed to shrink under the weight of it. He looked down at the table, unable to meet anyone's eyes, as the full extent of his actions came crashing down on him. "This meeting is over," David said, his voice firm. "Gary, I expect your resignation on my desk by the end of the day." Gary didn't argue. He couldn't. He simply nodded, his face a mask of defeat and humiliation. As the rest of the executives began to leave the room, Jamal remained standing by the doorway, watching as Gary slowly gathered his things and left without a word. It was a moment of reckoning, not just for Gary, but for everyone who had witnessed what had transpired. Jamal felt a mix of emotions, relief, vindication, and a lingering sense of disbelief that it had all finally come to a head. He knew that the fallout from this revelation would be significant, but he also knew that it was a necessary step towards creating a better environment within the company. As he watched Gary's retreating figure, Jamal couldn't help but feel a sense of closure, knowing that the truth had finally come to light. Gary's departure from Summit Solutions Group was swift and far from subtle. By the time he returned to his office to collect his belongings, the news of his termination had already started circulating among the employees. Whispers and hushed conversations filled the corridors, as Gary's reputation as an intimidating manager preceded him. His dismissal sent shockwaves through the office, shattering the image of invincibility that Gary had carefully cultivated over the years. He had always wielded his authority like a blunt instrument, intimidating subordinates and bending the rules to suit his agenda. Now, that very authority had crumbled, leaving him exposed and vulnerable. Gary sat at his desk, staring blankly at the half-empty cardboard box in front of him. His office, which had once been a symbol of his power, now felt like a prison, the walls closing in around him as he tried to process everything that had happened. He felt a knot of anger and shame in his chest, realizing that he had not just lost his job, he had lost his reputation, his standing, and the fear-driven respect of his peers. And perhaps most painfully, he had lost the chance to rewrite the narrative of his career in his favor. He had always prided himself on his ability to read people, to stay one step ahead, but he had completely misjudged Jamal. He had seen him as a convenient target, an opportunity to reinforce his own dominance by putting someone in their place. In his arrogance, Gary never imagined that Jamal's quiet resilience masked a deeper connection to the company's highest echelons. Now, it was too late to undo the damage he had caused, and the realization was a bitter pill to swallow. As Gary left the office for the last time, he felt the eyes of his former colleagues on him. Some watched with quiet satisfaction, having endured his bullying tactics over the years. Others simply avoided eye contact, unwilling to acknowledge the fallout of his actions. The walk to the elevator seemed interminable, and by the time the doors closed behind him, Gary felt the weight of his mistakes bearing down on him like a physical burden. The finality of it all hit him hard, and for the first time in years, Gary felt a deep sense of regret, not just for getting caught, but for the way he had allowed his own insecurities to drive his actions. He had pushed away everyone who might have supported him, leaving himself isolated and alone in the wake of his downfall. David Lawson, meanwhile, made it clear that Gary's termination wasn't about Jamal's identity as his son. In a company-wide email, David addressed the situation directly, outlining the company's zero-tolerance policy towards harassment, discrimination, and unprofessional conduct. Without naming Gary explicitly, the message conveyed that this was not an isolated incident or a matter of family connections. It was about maintaining the integrity of the company and ensuring a respectful workplace for everyone. David's handling of the situation sent a strong message to the entire company. Employees who had been on the receiving end of Gary's mistreatment felt a renewed sense of trust in the leadership. The change in the office atmosphere was palpable, as if a dark cloud had been lifted. Conversations that had once been stifled by fear and hierarchy now flowed more freely, and there was a collective sense of relief among the staff. For Jamal, the aftermath of Gary's departure was a period of reflection and healing. While he felt a sense of vindication, he was also keenly aware of the complexities of the situation. He hadn't set out to expose or embarrass Gary, nor had he wanted to use his father's influence to resolve the conflict. But as the truth came to light, Jamal felt a mixture of emotions: relief that Gary had been held accountable, but also a lingering sense of sadness for the way things had played out. Gary, on the other hand, struggled to come to terms with the reality of his new situation. He had never been the type to admit his faults, and his pride made it difficult for him to face the consequences of his actions. With his career in shambles and no immediate prospects on the horizon, Gary found himself reaching out to former colleagues and acquaintances, hoping to salvage what little was left of his reputation. But the doors that had once been open to him were now firmly closed. Word of his behavior had spread quickly through the industry, and no one was willing to vouch for him. Desperate and out of options, Gary decided to reach out to David Lawson in a final attempt to seek redemption. He crafted a carefully worded email, trying to strike a balance between apology and self-justification. He expressed regret for any misunderstandings and hoped that David would consider offering a reference to help him find new employment. In Gary's mind, he believed that acknowledging his mistakes, at least partially, might be enough to garner some sympathy or leniency. David read the email in silence, his expression unreadable. He had anticipated this move from Gary, knowing that a man like him wouldn't simply fade into obscurity without trying to claw his way back. But David's decision had already been made. He responded with a brief but firm message, refusing to provide a reference and reiterating that accountability was non-negotiable. David's words were clear. Gary's actions had consequences, and no amount of half-hearted apologies would change that. Gary's last hope for redemption was extinguished, leaving him to confront the full impact of his choices. Without a job, without allies, and with a tarnished reputation, he was left to grapple with the reality of his actions and the path that had led him here. He spent long, sleepless nights replaying the events in his mind, searching for someone or something to blame other than himself. But deep down, he knew that his downfall was the result of his own decisions driven by arrogance, prejudice, and a refusal to see others as equals. In the weeks that followed, Gary's attempts to rebuild his career continued to falter. His emails went unanswered, his calls unreturned. The silence from his former colleagues spoke volumes, a reflection of the bridges he had burned along the way. The professional world had moved on without him, leaving him isolated and adrift in a sea of regrets. Meanwhile, at Summit Solutions Group, the ripple effects of Gary's departure continued to be felt. Employees who had been hesitant to speak up about their own experiences began to find their voices, encouraged by the company's newfound commitment to accountability and transparency. Conversations about workplace culture and inclusivity became more open and constructive, and Jamal found himself at the center of these discussions. Jamal's decision to stay silent about his family connection had been a test, not just for himself, but for the company as a whole. By choosing to reveal the truth at the right moment, Jamal had shown not only his strength of character, but also his commitment to creating a workplace where merit and integrity were valued above all else. His colleagues, who had once seen him as just another intern, now looked to him with newfound respect and admiration. For David, the situation had been a delicate balancing act, one that required him to navigate the fine line between being a father and a CEO. He was proud of Jamal for standing up for himself and handling the situation with dignity, but he was also mindful of the lessons this experience had imparted on everyone involved. David knew that leading by example was the most powerful way to effect change, and he hoped that the events of the past few weeks would serve as a reminder to the entire company of the importance of accountability and respect. In the end, Gary was left to face the consequences of his actions alone. His attempts to avoid accountability and seek redemption were met with a firm but fair response. The past couldn't be rewritten, and forgiveness wasn't a given. He had been given the opportunity to change, to reflect, and to take responsibility. But he had chosen a different path, one that led to his downfall. With Gary gone, a weight seemed to lift from the atmosphere at Summit Solutions Group. It wasn't just the absence of his physical presence. It was the release of tension that had been building for months. The air in the office felt lighter, conversations more open and unguarded. For many, his departure wasn't just the removal of a problematic figure, but a symbol of change, an end to an era marked by intimidation and covert biases. Jamal approached each new day with a renewed sense of purpose and confidence. He had proven to himself and to others that he was more than capable of holding his own in the face of adversity. Despite the turbulent path he had been forced to navigate, he hadn't wavered in his principles or allowed himself to be defined by someone else's narrow expectations. The respect he now commanded wasn't merely because of the revelation of his identity, but because he had earned it through his work and conduct. Colleagues who had previously kept their distance out of uncertainty now approached Jamal with newfound camaraderie and openness. Some shared their own stories of facing prejudice or dealing with toxic managers, while others expressed admiration for how he had handled such a difficult situation with grace and integrity. Jamal was careful not to bask in the spotlight of his father's position, and his humility in the wake of the revelation only deepened the respect his peers felt towards him. Jamal didn't just see this moment as a personal victory, he saw it as a responsibility. He recognized that his story was now intertwined with the larger narrative of the company, and he wanted to use his experiences to help create meaningful change. He began working closely with the human resources team to initiate new policies and training programs focused on inclusivity and creating a safe, supportive workplace environment. Jamal's insights were invaluable, and he approached these efforts with the same quiet determination that had carried him through the past few months. Meanwhile, David Lawson felt a deep sense of pride in his son's journey. He had always believed in Jamal's abilities and integrity, but watching his son navigate this complex situation without relying on the privilege of his last name reaffirmed David's faith in him. As a CEO, David knew that the company's reputation hinged on more than just its financial success. It was also about its culture and the values it upheld. Seeing Jamal step up as a leader gave David hope that Summit Solutions was moving in the right direction. Father and son often found moments of quiet reflection together, sometimes after hours in David's office, or during weekend breakfasts where they could speak freely. David shared stories from his own early career, the challenges he faced, and the lessons he had learned about leadership and resilience. Jamal listened with a mix of curiosity and respect, seeing in his father a man who had navigated his own battles with integrity and resolve. David, in turn, was eager to hear Jamal's perspectives and ideas for the future of the company. But the story wasn't just about the Lawson family. It was also about the broader transformation happening within Summit Solutions. Jamal's experience became a catalyst for honest conversations about leadership, accountability, and the company's core values. Employees were encouraged to share their feedback openly, and new channels of communication were established to ensure that voices weren't just heard, but acted upon. There was a collective understanding that this was an opportunity for growth, and the company's leadership was determined not to let it pass by. Jamal's influence began to extend beyond his role as an intern. His initiative to engage with employees at all levels and his willingness to listen to their concerns led to new mentorship programs and leadership workshops designed to empower individuals and foster a culture of inclusivity. He became a trusted voice within the company, not because of his family connection, but because he had earned it through his actions and character. As for Gary, the consequences of his actions extended far beyond the loss of his job. His attempts to reach out to former colleagues or leverage past connections were met with cold indifference. The industry was small, and word traveled fast. His history of toxic behavior and prejudice wasn't easily forgotten, and the lack of a positive reference from his former employer was a significant blow to his prospects. Gary found himself grappling not just with unemployment, but with the realization that his own arrogance and choices had led him to this point. For a while, he tried to convince himself that he had been unfairly treated, that he was the victim of a company trying to protect its image. But as days turned into weeks and weeks into months, the silence from his former colleagues and the rejection letters piling up in his inbox forced him to confront an uncomfortable truth. His downfall was of his own making. Alone and isolated, Gary was left to reflect on the consequences of his actions and the choices that had brought him to this point. Whether he would learn from those mistakes remained to be seen, but the path to redemption, if he chose to pursue it, would not be an easy one. Back at Summit Solutions, the focus was on moving forward. Jamal's journey had been a test of resilience, not just for him, but for the company as a whole. It had exposed vulnerabilities, challenged assumptions, and forced everyone to confront uncomfortable truths. But it had also laid the groundwork for growth and transformation. As Jamal's internship came to an end, David offered him a permanent position within the company. But Jamal, after much thought, chose to continue his journey elsewhere. He wanted to explore other opportunities and expand his horizons before fully committing to the family business. David respected his decision, knowing that Jamal's desire to carve his own path was a testament to his independence and strength of character. In the months that followed, Jamal stayed connected with Summit Solutions, occasionally consulting on projects and initiatives. His departure wasn't an end, but a continuation of his journey, a journey that would lead him to new challenges, new lessons, and new opportunities to make a difference. And while he wasn't physically present at the company, his impact continued to be felt. Jamal's story served as a reminder to everyone at Summit Solutions that leadership wasn't just about titles or authority. It was about actions, integrity, and the willingness to stand up for what was right, even in the face of adversity. The company's transformation was still ongoing, but the foundation had been set. Employees felt more empowered to speak up. Leaders were held to higher standards, and the values of accountability and respect were no longer just words on a mission statement. They were principles that guided everyday actions. David and Jamal often reflected on how far they had come, both individually and as a family. For David, the experience had deepened his understanding of what it meant to be a leader and a father. He had watched his son grow, not just in professional competence, but in character, and he couldn't have been prouder of the man Jamal was becoming. And for Jamal, the journey had been a test of resilience, integrity, and self-discovery, one that had revealed his own strength and potential in ways he hadn't fully realized before. As Summit Solutions continued to evolve, Jamal and David knew that the work was far from over. Change was a journey, not a destination, and every step forward was an opportunity to build a better, more inclusive future. And while the path ahead would undoubtedly have its own challenges, they were ready to face them together, guided by the lessons they had learned and the values they now held even more deeply. Jamal's story wasn't just a story of overcoming adversity. It was a story of growth, transformation, and the power of standing up for what was right. It was a reminder that every challenge was an opportunity to learn, every setback a chance to grow, and every decision a reflection of the person one chose to be. And as he looked to the future, Jamal knew that he was ready, not just to lead, but to inspire others to do the same.